Engineers calculate payload capacities on trucks based on a number of different metrics, but of course, whenever you cut your truck in half, things change a bit. So today, I'm gonna put this truck back together in a way that hopefully makes sense, in a way that's gonna fit this narrow dually rear axle. We're gonna build some suspension, make some mistakes, rebuild some suspension. This is gonna be a huge video. Because of how we plan on using this truck, there's gonna be a lot of twisting and contorting that could lead to the most epic failure of failures on the trail. So we're gonna have to be extremely meticulous and thoughtful on the way that we continue forward on this project. The front of this frame is boxed and the rear section is C-channel. Right now, my intention is to retain as much of this C-channel section as possible. Otherwise, we're gonna have to replace the whole thing. And with all the packaging problems we're gonna run into to keep these dually tires, this could end up being one of the biggest packaging problems I've ever had to solve. Almost right away, I saw a giant rust section that I did not see before, so now we're gonna make this fish plate span a much broader distance to go past this rust section, so we can do our best job to repair it, but we're not going to rely on this for structural integrity anymore, because we're going to be able to sandwich up and get a little bit more strength with this 3/16 plate that we're going to run on this long span. When you cut a frame section in half and then weld it back together like we did, this is now obviously gonna be the weak point. And we don't want it to be the weak point. We don't want any weak points. We want this to perform just like it did when it was stock. In fact, I'd like it to perform better, so we're going to slightly stiffen up the frame while at the same time understanding that this does need to move and flex just a little bit. So, originally, I was gonna do a small fish plate on the inside, but after seeing the rust up here, I decided that I want to span this fish plate much broader. And this is gonna make it to where, in our up and down dimension, let's say you're hauling a lot of stuff in your bed going down the road, it's stressing the frame this way, and it's up and down dimension, which is why 1-ton trucks have tall frames to make it really strong against this sort of force. But when you're off-road, like what we're gonna do with this truck, the force is more gonna be this. This frame is gonna twist a whole bunch going down the trail. So with a giant heavy-duty rear cross member welded in, we should be able to reduce that twist, but still allowing it to have some flex. Since we didn't box in this frame section, and we just basically sistered a fish plate on the outside of it, it should do the same thing. It should make it stronger in the up and down dimension and make it to where it's gonna be really difficult. I don't want to say impossible. It's gonna make it really difficult to tear this frame because of this giant chunk of 3/16. But because it's just sistered up to the side of this and not boxed in, it should still allow some of this twisting to occur, which is really, really important. Unfortunately, my plan for this frame is about to change drastically. And I wanted to keep this little explanation of why, and I wanted to keep our C-channel section in here, because I wanted you to see that, like, I don't know it all, and these plans change. I've got a good overall idea of how I want all of this to work on the trail, but as far as the small details, they kind of work themselves out, in my opinion. So I need to be able to roll the axle we're actually gonna use underneath this frame and then see, is it gonna be a slight modification on the C-channel section in order to like accommodate our springs and our inside wheels of this dually? Or am I gonna have to reinvent the wheel? And in this case, we just have to reinvent the wheel. It's gonna make way more sense for us to cut the rivets, pull this whole C-channel section out, and like graft our own 2x6 box section in here. It's gonna be easier to make the types of bends and changes that we wanna make while still retaining structural integrity if we're starting with tube instead of starting with C-channel, if that makes sense. And then once we get a frame section that fits, it's gonna be easier for me to figure out exactly what 4-link suspension style is gonna package neatly in this truck. This was not my original intention, but here we are. We are going to make a more sturdy frame. I liked the idea of trying to keep it C-channel, but because of how narrow the dually axle is and spring placement and then shock placement, our packaging is really complicated because of me wanting to go dually. And Nick is very reasonable. Nick is like, hey man, what do you think about just like doing a single rear wheel? And maybe after the competition, we figure out how to make it dually. And I'm like, no, Nick, no, I want dually. So we are reinventing the wheel, and we're gonna build our own frame section for the back half of this truck. Think about that though, so that we can shove it. If you've watched my channel before, you've probably seen me lay things out on the floor. I do this a lot, and this is a perfect example of when it makes so much sense. I've got another guy working with me, Nick. And if I lay everything out on the floor, not only do I get accurate counts for like material quantities and things like that, and I'm able to keep my own ideas straight, but if I'm out getting material, or in this case, I was actually out, I was editing my Rocklander route video, Nick is able to look at the floor at a blueprint that is a 1-to-1 scale, and he can see exactly how things need to line up because I've got everything laid out. In this case, I'm using 2 different colors of chalk from 2 different chalk lines that I have in order to make it easy to see, and then I just use some clear contractor's spray paint over the top, let it cure, and then we can roll over it and we can sweep over it, and all the lines and everything are going to stay there for the remainder of us fabricating up this rear frame section. And then when I'm ready to remove these lines, just a little bit of acetone and a rag, boom, everything wipes right up. I have 2 sets of lights in here. We've got the lights that came with the shop, as you can see, and then there's like the bright lights that we installed. And I've found that working with this laser, if we just turn off the new lights and just have these like really cold blue lights, I don't know if you'll be able to see in the camera, it makes sure you can see the laser so much better, which is really nice. So I've got the frame most of the way figured out, but before I can continue the frame and before I can even give you an explanation as to how we landed on this like frame style, I need to make sure it's gonna work with the axle. So I'm gonna start tacking and building the suspension, and then once we get the suspension to a point where we can kind of cycle the axle with a dually on here, we can decide if this design for the rear frame section is gonna work. I've been building stuff on YouTube for like 5 years now, which is crazy. And what that means is that when people recognize me in public, they usually have questions about things that they're building. And when it comes to suspension stuff, I can tell whenever I'm talking to someone that they'll have all the basic knowledge on how to do some of this stuff from watching YouTube and doing a bunch of research, reading forums and stuff, but they're kind of like frozen in place because they don't even hardly know where to start. So to me, I like to start with the stuff that I know and then slowly work out the details that I don't know. I've got these killer combo brackets from Barnes 4-Wheel Drive, and these are like it's a coil bracket on top and it's a link mount on the bottom, and it's all one piece. So I know where those need to be with these trailing arms, so let's tack those on, and then we'll move on to something that's a little bit more complicated, and that's going to be how am I going to make this truss fit with our newly narrowed frame section and make it to where nothing's gonna hit. Because of the way we're building this truck, it's going to be really easy to spin axle tubes in this rear axle. So in order to get ahead of that, I'm going to weld the axle tubes to the center section using a method that I have found to be the best one that I've tried over the years. And then we're also going to use a bridge, and this bridge is going to connect the pinion to the axle tubes, and we'll get to that in a minute. First, we need to get this welded up. And what I've done is I emailed a cast iron fitting company a number of years ago, and I got information on how they weld cast, and I just replicate that here in automotive. So I'm heating up the center section between 400 and 600 degrees. In this case, we're gonna be just under 500. I welded up with a specialized rod that was recommended to me from this fitting manufacturer, and this stuff works really good, but you gotta hook it up in reverse polarity, and you gotta preheat everything before you use it. This stuff's really good too in the fact that it's not picky on whether or not your material is super clean, because a lot of times when you get it hot like this, you're gonna start boiling out oil and paint and all this crap, but because you're stick welding it with the specialized rod, it does not seem to care. As I'm welding, I'm keeping my torch on to make sure that this center section stays hot throughout this entire process. I don't want it to cool too quickly, and then I wrap everything with 2 welding blankets, and then I even put like some welding jackets and stuff. Anything flame retardant, I just put over the top of it, let it sit overnight, and then in the next day, I haven't had any issues with any cracks or anything in the weld, and I haven't had any fails on the trail so far using this method. I have seen a lot of rear axles over the years spin one or both tubes on the trail. It's pretty crazy. So it's not uncommon to see people weld the tubes into the center section, and this is the method that I've found that works best for me, just using rod. I'm not a great stick welder, but I can definitely get this stuff to stick together. Anyway, because we have so much more low-end torque than an average off-road build, it's going through a 4-to-1 T-case. It's a Cummins torque going through a 4-to-1 T-case. It's gonna be a big, heavy truck moving on the trail. It's gonna have dually rear tires, so if we have great traction, we're gonna be able to apply an insane amount of force, and it would be very easy for us to spin one of these tubes. So I welded it. I didn't weld all the way around. I don't have a whole lot of rod, so we just welded like the front, like 25%, but that's definitely enough to help keep it from twisting. And on top of that, we're taking advantage of the fact that this is a 14 bolt. Because it's a 14 bolt, we have a drop-in pinion, and that gives us the ability to run a pinion guard. Most axles aren't set up this way. And because we can run this pinion guard, we can also use this as a bridge between our center section and our truss. The truss is gonna be welded to the tubes. This is bolted to the pinion, which is the center section. So between these two strategies, I'm really confident that we can get pretty wild with this thing and not spin tubes. Now, we might break axle shafts, but that's a whole nother problem to solve. Right now, we're just trying to get ahead of like the fabrication problems while we're here building stuff. And next, I still have a lot more fitment stuff to figure out. So now that everything's cool, I can kind of clean it up a little bit, and then I can start figuring out how I want to shape the rest of this truss and just burn it all together. I really want to have an off-road dually, and because of that, the inside dually tires made it to where we had to have a narrowed frame, and because of that, that narrowed frame made it to where we had to have a narrowed truss, and because of that, this is not going to act like a truss normally should. It's not going to be tall enough and broad enough in order to strengthen this axle, but it still has the functionality of the fact that it's going to help keep this axle from spinning tubes, and this is going to be a mount for our upper control arms. So this still has a really important job. It's just, we're calling it a truss as being very generous at this point because I'm having to cut a lot out in order to meet the unique needs of this project. it looks like the suspension design that I have in my head is going to work, so I can confidently move forward with finishing the modifications to the frame, at least getting really close to finishing. And I've decided that because we now have such a short section of C-channel, we need to box the whole thing. Because again, what happens is when you make everything rigid around C-channel, you now get cracks in your C-channel. So that's going to be pretty easy. We're just going to plate the inside of this really tall section. It also gives me a lot of confidence that where we are plating is the tallest section of the frame. But in any case, once we get this boxed, I'll be able to lay out upper control arm mounts on the inside of these frame rails, and then we're gonna have to play with a couple of different suspension designs and see what cycles the best with this project. Oh yeah. What do you got there, Nick?
Couple of skinny 37s.
Couple of skinny 37s.
In a dually-like format.
37, 1150. I thought these were 1050s, but either way, I like how narrow that is. I mean, if we put one of these next to it, I don't think that it's that much wider than the tires that we just pulled off. You know, it's a little more boxed, so, oh, this makes me feel like it might work. Hold those like right there. That's how, dude, look how thick that rear meat's gonna be though. It's gonna be that wide. Maybe wider once we get it on a rim. I think a dually off-road truck is super cool, but I am not doing myself any favors when it comes to the amount of work that we're having to do. I mean, if I didn't have to rebuild this whole, and design this whole rear frame section and make all these crazy accommodations for these 37s, these dually 37s, we would be so far ahead on this project. But this is just the reality. Sometimes you want something that is unusual and it's gonna take a lot of work to get there. But once it's all said and done, I'm gonna look back and be really glad that we did all this work because it's gonna be so neat. That said, the frame. I did not plan, I knew we were gonna have to make some changes to the frame around where the tires were. I was hoping that they wouldn't be so dramatic that I'd be able to keep the C-channel section. Obviously, like once we rolled the axle underneath there and I could see stuff not with a tape measure, but see real world, this is a tire near a piece of steel, I was able to determine that's not gonna work. And for the crazy modifications we had to do, it doesn't make sense to do that in C-channel either. We wanna make sure this is really strong, so it's all 2x6 box tube, or rectangular tube. We threw some fat gussets in right here at the joints. It goes in all the way to this cross member that we added. So we've got a really nice stout connection point here. We even used some of the factory frame and like wrapped it in and welded it into this. So I'm really confident in all that. Then we had a very small section of C-channel. It's the tallest section of frame of the whole chassis, so it's really strong in like the up and down dimension. But it's not gonna, this is gonna officially be a weak point when things start to really get twisted up off-road. So for that reason, we boxed this tiny little section in to make it to where now from nose to tail, the entire frame is boxed. And this should be a really strong unit now. I mean, stronger than a factory 1-ton frame, at least the one that was on here. So the way that I have this figured out is that we've got dually tires here. They're huge. We're going to put the coil as close to this rear frame section as I possibly can. And then if we have to space this out in order to get like a 1/2 inch of clearance or inch of clearance, whatever we got to do, we're going to make it work. This is still going to end up being way narrower than the dually axle we pulled out of here. And it's easier to widen something than it is to narrow it when it comes to axles. The shocks are really complicated, which is why I decided to do trailing arms to mount our shocks. So right where this frame section dives in is going to be probably a triple bypass shock. Our budget is rough right now. I'm gonna do my best to keep everything within the budget, but we've got to do what we got to do to make a good truck. So to me, top priority is make a good truck. Second priority is to try to do it as close to budget as possible. Third priority is to learn that when I'm doing a budget build-off, don't add more wheels and tires than you probably should. The next thing we're working on is going to be a triangulated upper link called a wishbone. I haven't done a suspension like this since, like, I don't know, 15 years ago. The very first TJ suspension that I ever built, I actually have a trophy over on the wall over there from winning best suspension competition with it. And I did a wishbone upper link in the TJ with just like 2 parallel links on the bottom, which is essentially what this is gonna be. The difference is I'm gonna have better angles here, so it should be a little bit more stable. And it's actually one of the reasons I wanna go with a wishbone upper. I think that it's gonna help resist our side-to-side movement in a vehicle this heavy really, really well, as long as we can keep that link flat. And so that's what the goal is here. The con is I think we're gonna burn through these bushings often, but I won't know until we test the system. And the good news is I could always go back. These mounts, all the chassis side stuff will not change, but if I had to, I could cut this weird upper link mount that I made on the diff back here, and we could just turn that into 2 link. We could turn this into a normal traditional 4 link later if we want to, but I want to experiment, don't you?
The first style of suspension we're going to test is going to be a wishbone upper link. So it's a 3 link with a wishbone upper. I've done this before, but I didn't use trailing arms, and my concern is because of the nature of how the wishbone is going to cycle side to side, it might make the angles on our shock shafts too extreme to make this practical.
So I like this suspension and the fact that it's going to keep things from going side to side super well. Like, this is going to be a strong connection point for that. But when we flex it, if you watch how much swing the axle is going to have, I'm really curious to see how much side to side movement we're going to get out of these trailing arms. So like, this is kind of a big test. Let's try it. See if I can do this without it sliding off. It's definitely higher. And see, that side would keep dropping, I think.
This is performing exactly how I was hoping it wouldn't, but I had a feeling it would. And the wishbone is swinging the trailing arms one way or another, and it's a problem because it's going to pitch the bottom of our shock shafts, and with enough misalignment and, you know, spacers and stuff down there, we could definitely make that work, but I would rather not have to mess with it. And I think that it would be easier to just cut this upper link off and experiment with another suspension style. I don't want to just go straight to a single triangulated 4 link, so our upper links would be 2 separate links, but they would be triangulated, because I don't think it's going to perform that much better than the wishbone. So for that reason, we're going to try doing a parallel 4 link with a panhard bar. The problem is we're going to have a little bit of triangulation in these upper links because I've narrowed the frame so much, but they're long enough that I could see a world where we might be able to get away with it. But in any case, we should see binding in this scenario just by flexing it.
All the way down, I'll go up, let's see.
Do you see how the passenger side of the axle is trying to follow the driver's side as I jack this up? It's because there's binding. I even have Nick push down on it, and then we crack off one of these upper links, and that's because we're binding. Even the tiniest amount of triangulation on a parallel 4 link will fight a panhard bar. Now, if we burn this all in, and it was all just 1/4 inch steel welded to 1/4 inch steel, this could be one of those characteristics where the ride is a little funky and we don't know why, or it burns through bushings faster than normal or whatever, and people will just live with it. But as you can see here, that binding is a huge problem from this tiny little bit of triangulation of the upper links. I even pull the panhard bar out of the way and we cycle it, and that problem doesn't exist anymore. It's no longer trying to float both sides whenever I jack up the one side. So now we're on plan C, and plan C is probably what we should have started with, and that is just trailing arms with a single triangulated upper. So we're going to have 2 upper control arms shaped in a V pattern, and that is going to make it to where we can get rid of the panhard bar, and we're just going to have 4 links, very simply locating this axle throughout its suspension cycle.
Well, already it's not trying to float both sides, so that's a good sign.
This suspension style solved one of our problems, in the fact that we no longer have any binding. It's cycling exactly like it should. However, we do have that swing effect, which is less than ideal, but it does seem like the trailing arms are not pitching in or out near as bad as it was whenever we had the wishbone style. And I wish that I would have taken some sort of measurements with a laser so that we could actually get some accurate measurements on how much pitch we have. In any case, this is the suspension style we're going with. Because of packaging constraints, sometimes you don't get to have your cake and eat it too, and this is one of those situations where this is basically the only real viable option for us.
The truck's going to be a couple inches taller than this, as you can see. The axle's not in the center of the tire, but this is roughly what it's going to look like as far as where the tires are laid out. So as you can see, we're not a mile wide. It's really not that bad. And the fronts, I accidentally ordered the wrong wheel size. So my plan for the front, we've got DIY beadlocks on some just like standard Steelies. And these are going to be 37, 1350, R17. They're all going to be R17, but I accidentally ordered R22. But this is the width. I wanted to go way wider in the front. We've got a Cummins to support. I didn't want to do dually wheels in the front. It's not going to perform the way that I would like it to if we have to go with a narrow tire up front. I want a fat tire in the front. I want two narrow tires in the back to basically make one crazy wide tire in the back. And I think that this is going to give us the best performance off-road. This thing's heavy. It's going to need some flotation, and so it needs a lot of contact patch to accomplish that. The rear wheels, we're going to do dually beadlocks with these DIY beadlocks. I'm not even sure if any companies make dually beadlocks, but in any case, I've got all these dually wheels that are the right size, and the beadlock kits they're not cheap, but they're cheap enough to make this practical. And I think with 6 aired down tires, this thing's it's gonna have some grip. Now I'm gonna tinker with the front. I laid everything out. I'm gonna do radius arms in the front because it is simple, and what I can do is I can utilize the brackets that are already on this front axle, because this Super Duty Dana 60 is already set up for radius arms, and I have an idea of how to make the radius arms fit in here and gain a little bit of clearance over my original plan, which was going to be using the factory Super Duty radius arms.
When I agreed to do this Onyx build challenge, a lot of things hadn't happened in my life yet. I didn't know that I was going to be moving yet, so that was 5 months out of this build time that I thought I had for me to move, build my new shop, start my new life with my family. I didn't know that I was going to total my Tacoma by hitting an elk, so now I need to build that this summer because I need wheels. Right now I'm like driving a tow truck around as my daily. I find myself torn because I'm starting to fall in love with this Jeep truck in the way that I did with my Samurai, and it made it to where I pushed myself to new levels of creativity with that Samurai, and I ended up with a product that I was truly happy with. And it's something that we're still it's not done. I'm actually gonna start working on it again next week, but it's something that when I look at it, I'm so pumped that that came out of my mind and that I was able to put that into reality. And this Jeep truck is starting to feel the same way. Originally, I was going to use the stock Dodge Ram front and rear axles, but when it came time to make the decision, I had to upgrade them. And then the same thing with the rear suspension. We could have went way simpler, but I find myself having to upgrade it because when I look at this now, I can see something so cool in my mind that I can't shake it. So am I willing to make the concessions necessary and the compromises necessary in order to get this done in time for the Onyx Build Challenge in October? I don't know.
I gotta get out of that shop. Let's go for a walk. I don't know what I'm trying to say. I think I'm really feeling the pressure of losing those 5 months that was originally gonna be designated to building. I'm pointing back there because way off in the distance is my shop back on the other side of the property. I'm feeling the pressure of how quickly October is approaching, and I'm looking at this truck and I'm thinking like, I've got 5 months left to build this thing, easy. Like as far as what it's gonna take for it to be the way I want it. And so I'm feeling the heat and I'm a little concerned about where we stand. And I'm looking at the other teams. Holy cow, there are people on 43s. Originally, this was going to be like an overland thing. And then it changed slightly because they allowed everyone to bring trailers if they wanted to. They don't have to drive it on the street if they don't want to. And then everyone just started going nuts. And now I'm like, well, am I even going to build a truck capable of doing whatever the heck these guys are going to be doing? So I don't know. I'm tempted to bring in another project, something that I could knock out in like 6 to 8 weeks instead of 5 months, and something that's actually going to be a rock crawler. I don't want to destroy this truck. I love this truck already, and I guess I'm just really torn. So there's me being honest to the internet. I hope that you enjoyed this video, and I hope that you continue to watch these throughout the summer. I've got a lot more projects on the way. I've got something I just picked up that's really cool, and we're going to be building this J10 for the foreseeable future. So make sure you vote for Team Dirt Lifestyle. We'll see you on the next one.